The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of a two-story Victorian home in the Highlands neighborhood of Denver. It was a Saturday in late May, the kind of spring day that makes people believe in fresh starts and second chances. Had spent the early hours of the morning preparing Emma for their trip to Lincoln Park, a routine they developed over the past 6 months, though one that rarely produced the results desperately hoped for. She moved through the familiar rituals with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to operate on autopilot, pushing back the disappointment that came with each unsuccessful outing. Emma stood in the hallway, dressed in her favorite pink sundress with tiny embroidered butterflies that her late mother had given her as a gift 2 years ago. The dress had become something of a security blanket for the child, a tangible connection to her mother, who had passed away when Emma was barely 18 months old, had allowed Emma to wear it constantly, understanding that children with autism often clung to specific items for comfort and stability. The butterflies on the dress seemed fitting somehow, symbolic of transformation and hope, even if that hope had grown threadbare over the past 18 months of silence. Herself was 67 years old, and the responsibility of raising Emma alone had aged her beyond her years. Her silver hair, once thick and lustrous, had thinned considerably. Her hands bore the brown spots of advancing age, and she moved more slowly than she had even 2 years prior. She'd retired from her career as a school librarian to care for her granddaughter, a decision she'd never regretted despite its emotional toll. Emma's father, son-in-law, had moved to Phoenix, leaving his daughter in capable but increasingly weary hands. The apartment where Emma lived before moving in with had been chaotic and unpredictable. Emma's mother's daughter, Lisa, had struggled with anxiety and depression throughout Emma's infancy. After Lisa's sudden death from a brain aneurysm, Emma had been so traumatized that she'd essentially retreated into herself. The doctors called it selective mutism, a psychological condition where children could speak, but chose not to, typically as a response to anxiety or trauma. Emma's case had been severe from the beginning, but it had deteriorated dramatically in the months following her mother's death. When Emma first came to live with at age 18 months, she'd still made occasional sounds, babbling, laughing at silly faces, humming along to songs on the radio. But gradually, over the following 18 months, even those vocalizations had disappeared. By the time she turned 3, Emma had become virtually silent. She communicated through pointing, through elaborate systems of signs she'd invented, through the occasional cry when she was hungry or hurt, but she had not voluntarily spoken a word to anyone outside the house in longer than could accurately remember. Speech therapy appointments had been a weekly ritual for over a year. Dr. Williams, Emma's therapist, was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and an almost supernatural patience. She came to the house every Tuesday afternoon, bringing toys and games designed to stimulate language development. Emma tolerated these sessions with the grim resignation of a prisoner undergoing required medical examinations. She would sit across from Dr. Williams, play with the toys, sometimes smile at a particularly silly face, but never, not once in 52 sessions, had she spoken a word directly to the therapist. Dr. Williams assured that progress was being made, that selective mutism in young children wasn't permanent, that with time and consistent therapy, Emma would eventually find her voice again. But 18 months was a long time to wait for a 3-year-old to speak. 18 months was long enough for her to begin wondering if she was failing her granddaughter, if there was something more she should be doing, if Emma's silence was somehow a reflection of her own inadequacy as a caregiver. She'd attended support groups for grandparents raising, had read books on autism spectrum disorder until her eyes burned from exhaustion, had tried every technique suggested by therapists and internet parenting forums. And still, Emma remained silent. The walk to Lincoln Park took 15 minutes, held Emma's small hand as they navigated the sidewalks, passing neighbors who'd grown accustomed to their routine. Mrs. from 3 doors down waved from her garden and managed a tired smile. Emma walked mechanically, her eyes focused on the ground in front of her, though sometimes wondered what her granddaughter was actually seeing. Was she lost in her own internal world? Was she counting the cracks in the sidewalk? Was she thinking about her mother? These questions haunted during the quiet hours of the night when she couldn't sleep. Lincoln Park was one of Denver's most beautiful green spaces. It sprawled across 38 acres, featuring manicured lawns, mature shade trees that had stood for decades, a playground with equipment for children of various ages, and several open-air picnic areas. On weekends, the park filled with joggers, families, elderly couples taking their daily walks, children playing soccer and frisbee. It was the kind of place that seemed designed to heal simply by being present within it. Typically brought Emma to the park on Saturday mornings because the crowds were moderate, populated enough to provide some stimulation and activity, but not so overwhelming that Emma became completely shut down. She'd learned her granddaughter's thresholds and boundaries through careful observation and trial and error. Too much stimulation, and Emma would become rigid and anxious. Too little, and she seemed to sink deeper into her internal world. The balance was precarious and constantly shifting. They arrived at the park around 10 in the morning, guided Emma to their usual spot near the large oak tree in the central meadow. She'd brought a small cloth blanket, some crackers, a juice box, and a coloring book with colored pencils. This was the extent of their park routine. They would sit. Emma would occasionally leaf through the coloring book without actually coloring anything, and would watch other children playing with a mixture of longing and resignation. But today felt different somehow, though couldn't have articulated why. Perhaps it was the particular quality of the light, or the gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers. Perhaps it was simply that had woken up that morning with a prayer on her lips, something she did less frequently now than she had in her younger years, a desperate plea to the universe or God or whatever force governed such things. Please help my granddaughter find her way back to us. As they settled onto their blanket, noticed an unusual amount of activity near the park's entrance. A police car was parked along the curb, and several officers in uniform were setting up what appeared to be some kind of community event. Tables were being arranged in a line, and officers were carrying various materials from the vehicle. Squinted, trying to make out what was happening. She'd seen notices about this community policing initiative, but had largely ignored them, assuming they were just routine police presence activities. Then she saw the dog. Officer led Duke across the lawn with practiced ease, the German shepherd moving in perfect heel position, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Even from a distance, Duke was an impressive animal, muscular, alert, dignified in the way that well-trained dogs can be. Was perhaps in his late 30s, with the upright posture and measured movements of someone trained in discipline and procedure. He moved through the park with the confidence of a man doing work that mattered. Felt Emma tense beside her. The girl had frozen, her entire body suddenly rigid with attention. His heart performed an anxious little flutter in her chest. Emma had always been nervous around dogs. On the few occasions they'd encountered neighborhood dogs, Emma had either hidden behind or backed away with a look of profound anxiety, prepared herself to comfort her granddaughter through whatever fear response was about to unfold. But nothing could have prepared her for what actually happened next. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Felt it immediately, the sudden intake of air, the way her granddaughter's small body seemed to shift from its typical state of withdrawn calm into something entirely different. Emma's eyes, which usually moved slowly and deliberately across her environment, suddenly locked onto the dog with laser-like intensity. Her pupils dilated. Her small mouth opened slightly. His protective instincts flared to life, preparing for the anxiety response she'd witnessed countless times before. But then something miraculous happened. Emma stood up. Not the slow, methodical standing that characterized most of Emma's movements, but a quick, decisive movement. She rose to her feet with purpose, her little legs carrying her forward with determination. His hand moved instinctively to grab her granddaughter's arm, but something in the quality of Emma's movement made her hesitate. This wasn't flight. This wasn't fear. This was something else entirely. "Emma, wait," called out softly, not wanting to startle her granddaughter but also unable to let her run completely unsupervised across the park. The child paused for just a moment, glancing back at her grandmother with an expression had never seen before. It was as if Emma was asking permission, or perhaps confirming that could see what she was seeing. Gave a small nod, and Emma continued forward, her eyes never leaving Duke. Officer noticed the approaching child immediately. He'd worked in community policing long enough to develop almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings, particularly when children were involved. He watched as the small girl in the pink butterfly dress moved toward him and Duke with an intensity that seemed unusual. Most children either rushed toward the dog with unrestrained enthusiasm or hung back shyly. This girl did neither. She moved with a focused purpose that reminded of something he'd witnessed before, but couldn't quite place in his memory. Knelt down, making himself smaller, less threatening. This was standard protocol for introducing children to the dog. Always position yourself at the child's level, never loom over them. Duke responded immediately to the signal, sitting perfectly still, his tail wagging gently. The dog had been trained in countless community interactions, but sometimes thought Duke understood something deeper about traumatized or anxious children. The dog seemed to sense their fear and adjust his own demeanor accordingly. Emma stopped about 3 feet away from them. She didn't come any closer. She simply stood there, her small hand rising slowly, deliberately, until her tiny index finger extended outward, pointing directly at Duke's face. Her lips trembled slightly. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Who had followed her granddaughter at a respectful distance held her breath. The park seemed to pause around them. The sounds of playing children, of joggers running past, of the distant traffic on nearby streets, all of it faded into background noise. There was only Emma, the dog, and Officer, locked in a moment that would later be described as transcendent by those who witnessed it. "That's Duke," Officer said softly, his voice pitched low and gentle. He spoke the way one might speak in a library or a church with reverence for the sanctity of the moment. "He's a police dog. He helps me every day." Kept his voice calm and steady, instinctively understanding that this child needed a specific kind of engagement. He didn't ask Emma questions. He didn't try to draw her into conversation. He simply provided information, the way a narrator might describe a scene in a film. Emma's pointing finger wavered but didn't drop. She was trembling now, trembling so intensely that could see it from where she stood several feet away. The grandmother moved closer, concern flooding through her. Was Emma having an anxiety attack? Should she intervene? But something held her back. Some deep intuition told her that this moment was important and fragile, like watching a butterfly emerge from its chrysalis. Any interference might damage whatever transformation was occurring. "Duke is very friendly," continued, speaking to Emma as if she were perfectly capable of understanding every word. "He likes children. He especially likes children who are thoughtful and careful, like you appear to be." Years working as a police officer had taught him to read people, to assess situations quickly. This wasn't a typical child encounter. The girl's intensity suggested something deeper than simple curiosity about an animal. Emma's arm lowered slowly. Her pointing finger curled back into her hand. For a moment, thought her granddaughter was going to turn and walk away, retreating into her internal world as she always did when confronted with something emotionally overwhelming. But instead, Emma took a step forward, then another, and another. "Would you like to touch him?" asked, his voice still soft and measured. "You can pet his head, he likes that very much." Emma was standing directly beside Duke now. The dog's massive head was level with her chest. The disparity in their sizes was striking. The large, muscular police dog and the tiny 3-year-old girl who hadn't voluntarily spoken to another human being in longer than most people could imagine. Emma's hand reached out tentatively, her small fingers hovering above the dog's fur as if she were afraid the touch might burn her. "It's okay," said, "go ahead." Emma's hand made contact with Duke's coat. The moment her skin touched the dog's fur, something shifted in her expression. Her face softened. Her shoulders, which had been held rigidly high with tension, relaxed slightly. She closed her eyes and continued stroking the dog's head, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate, more reverent. Felt tears begin to form. She watched her granddaughter, her silent, isolated, traumatized granddaughter, touching another living being with tenderness and apparent joy. The weight of the past 18 months, the worry, the sleepless nights, the endless sessions with therapists and doctors, suddenly compressed into a single point of hope in his chest. Other visitors to the park had begun to notice the scene. A few people stopped what they were doing to watch. Some pulled out their phones, capturing the image of the small child and the large dog in a moment that transcended the ordinary. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to break the spell that had settled over this corner of Lincoln Park. Emma made a sound. It was barely audible, more of a breath than anything else, but it was a vocalization, something that came from her throat, something intentional. She opened her eyes and looked at Officer, then back at the dog. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were trying to form words that had been trapped inside her for so very long. His heart hammered in her chest. She took a step closer, afraid that if she blinked, this moment would vanish like morning mist in sunshine. And then Emma did something that would change the trajectory of her life forever. She opened her mouth and spoke. The word hung in the air between them like a soap bubble, fragile, luminescent, impossible to take back. Emma had said something. She had made a deliberate vocalization directed outward toward another human being. It was a sound so small that someone standing more than 10 feet away might have missed it entirely. But it was as if her granddaughter had just announced her presence to the entire universe. The grandmother's legs felt weak. She reached out and steadied herself against the nearby oak tree, afraid that if she didn't, she might collapse right there on the park lawn. Officer remained perfectly still. He'd been trained extensively in how to handle high-stress situations involving weapons, violence, and dangerous suspects, but nothing in his police academy training had prepared him for how to respond to this. He'd witnessed animal-assisted interventions before. The department had partnered with a local animal therapy organization on several occasions, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. This wasn't simply a child enjoying interaction with a friendly dog. This was something more profound, something almost spiritual in nature. "Yes," said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is Duke the dog." He kept his words simple, his tone even and calm. He'd intuitively grasped that this moment required the utmost delicacy, as if he were handling spun glass or a soap bubble moments before it popped. Any sudden movement, any loud noise, any emotional outburst could shatter whatever was happening. Emma continued to stroke Duke's head, her small fingers working methodically through the dog's fur. The police dog, for his part, responded with an almost supernatural patience. Duke's training had been rigorous and extensive. He'd been taught to remain calm during search operations, to maintain focus during narcotics detection, to respond appropriately to commands in high-stress situations. But this seemed to transcend his training. The dog appeared to understand that he was participating in something important. His tail wagged gently, his breathing synchronized with Emma's. His entire body language communicated acceptance, safety, and unconditional presence. Moved closer now, no longer able to maintain the respectful distance she'd established. She approached her granddaughter slowly, approaching as one might approach a wild animal, with care, with respect, with the awareness that sudden movements could trigger flight. When she reached Emma, she placed one hand gently on the child's shoulder. Emma didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly backward into her grandmother's touch, still maintaining her connection with Duke. Other visitors to the park had definitely noticed something significant was occurring. A woman with a jogging stroller had stopped and was watching with curiosity. An elderly couple sitting on a nearby bench had turned to observe. A young father with 2 children of his own had paused mid-play, his attention drawn to the scene unfolding before him. Whispers began. Phones were being held up, cameras capturing the moment. Nobody wanted to interrupt the scene. but everyone seemed to sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Emma made another sound, slightly louder than the first, more clearly articulated. It was still wordless, still just a vocalization, but it was intentional and directed. She was humming. Not a traditional melody, but a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from deep within her chest. It was as if the act of touching Duke had unlocked something within her, some ancient, primal form of communication that predated human language. Officer, recognizing what was happening, began to speak about Duke in a conversational tone, as if he and Emma were old friends catching up on a lazy afternoon. "Duke has been my partner for 4 years," he said. "We work together every day. He helps me keep people safe. He's the best partner I've ever had." Spoke with genuine affection in his voice, the kind of love that comes from working alongside someone through difficult situations, from trusting them with your life, and having that trust returned infinitely. As spoke, Emma's humming continued. Her other hand came up to stroke Duke's other side. The dog rotated slightly, as if to provide access to different parts of his coat. The interaction was becoming increasingly intimate, not in a physical sense, but in the emotional resonance that was building between child and animal. It was as if they were communicating through a language that didn't require words, a primal form of connection that transcended the limitations of human speech. Felt her knees become unsteady. She settled onto the park lawn beside her granddaughter, her own hand joining Emma's on Duke's fur. 3 beings connected now, the woman, the child, the dog, all touching, all present, all engaged in this extraordinary moment. Tears flowed freely down weathered cheeks. She made no effort to wipe them away. This was a moment that deserved her full emotional presence. "What's your name?" Officer asked Emma gently, not expecting a verbal response but asking the question anyway, planting seeds that might grow into future communication. Emma's humming stopped. She turned her head slightly, looking up at the police officer. Her dark eyes seemed to focus on him with intense clarity. Her lips moved. They trembled. Her mouth opened as if she were about to speak, but nothing came out. She closed her eyes and for a moment thought they'd lost her, that Emma had retreated back into her internal world. But then Duke pressed his head slightly against Emma's hand. The dog was seeking more attention, more contact, more presence. Emma's eyes opened. She looked back at the dog. And then, in a voice so small that had to strain to hear it, Emma whispered a single word. "Good." "Good," Officer repeated, his voice filled with warmth and encouragement. "Yes, Duke is very good. He's a very good dog." Emma nodded slowly. She turned back to Duke and her lips moved again. This time the words came slightly more clearly, slightly more confidently. "Nice dog, good dog, nice." His entire body went rigid. Had she heard correctly? Had Emma actually spoken multiple words? She looked at Officer, whose eyes had widened. He nodded subtly, confirming that he'd heard what had heard. The officer's professional composure had cracked slightly, revealing the profound emotion underneath. Emma continued stroking Duke, her whispered words becoming slightly more consistent. "Good dog. Nice dog, you nice. Duke nice. Good Duke." The words weren't coming quickly or naturally. There were still long pauses between phrases, still moments where Emma seemed to be wrestling with the mechanics of speech, but they were coming. The words were emerging from wherever they had been trapped inside her, released by something about this dog, this moment, this connection. The elderly couple on the nearby bench were holding hands, watching with expressions of pure wonder. The young father had called his children over to observe. The woman with the jogging stroller had pulled out her phone, filming the scene. None of them had any idea who Emma was or why this moment was so significant, but they could all sense that something miraculous was happening in this small corner of Lincoln Park on a Saturday morning in May. Placed her other hand over her mouth, afraid that if she made any sound at all, she might break this spell that had somehow been cast over her granddaughter. She watched in amazement as Emma, the silent child, continued to speak, quietly, hesitantly, but unmistakably speaking, to the dog that had somehow unlocked the words that had been imprisoned within her for so very long. and as Emma continued to whisper her words to Duke, understood with absolute certainty that her prayer had been answered. The universe, or God, or whatever force governed such things, had listened, and it had sent them a German shepherd named Duke. Time seemed to move differently in that moment, simultaneously racing forward and standing perfectly still. Minutes passed like hours. Hours felt like seconds. The world around the three figures on the grass, the dog, the child, and the grandmother, seemed to fade into a soft-focus background, as if someone had adjusted the lens of reality to bring only this one interaction into sharp, brilliant clarity. Emma continued to whisper words to Duke, each phrase slightly more confident than the last, though each one remained tentative, as if she were testing the mechanisms of her own voice to ensure they still worked. Good dog, nice dog, soft, soft fur, you nice. Duke nice. Very nice, Emma whispered, her small voice growing incrementally stronger. The words weren't flowing naturally yet. There were still significant pauses between phrases, still moments where her lips moved without producing sound, still evidence of the enormous effort this simple act of speech required. But the words were coming. After 18 months of silence, after more than 500 days of not voluntarily speaking to anyone outside her family, Emma was speaking. The impossible was happening in real time. Officer remained kneeling beside them, his professional demeanor gradually giving way to genuine emotion. He was a trained police officer, a man accustomed to maintaining composure in high-stress situations, but he found himself fighting back tears. In 12 years of law enforcement, he had rescued people from dangerous situations, had comforted victims of crimes, had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. But nothing had prepared him for the profound beauty of witnessing a child find her voice again. The significance of the moment seemed almost too large for a single human heart to contain. "She's speaking," said, her voice breaking with emotion. She wasn't asking a question. She was simply stating a fact that she needed to voice aloud, needed to confirm through her own utterance. "Emma is speaking. My Emma is speaking." Nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Yes," he said quietly, "she is. This is remarkable. This is truly remarkable." Duke, as if understanding that he was participating in something important, pressed himself even more firmly against Emma. The dog's massive head rested gently against the girl's chest. Emma wrapped her small arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. Her whispers became slightly muffled but no less intense. "Good Duke, best dog, I like you. You nice to me. Nobody mean, you not mean, you kind, Duke kind." The words tumbled out now in a more continuous stream, though still punctuated by pauses. Emma was speaking in simple, repetitive phrases, the linguistic patterns of a much younger child, but these were words nonetheless. These were thoughts being externalized, emotions being communicated, a consciousness reaching out from isolation toward connection. Every single word represented a victory, a triumph, a small miracle. Found herself unable to contain her emotions. She wept openly, her shoulders shaking with the force of her tears. These weren't tears of sadness, though sadness was certainly part of what she felt. Sadness for the months of silence, for the worry, for the nights she'd spent wondering if her granddaughter would ever speak again. These were tears of release, of hope fulfilled, of a prayer answered in the most unexpected way possible. Around them, the park had become eerily quiet. The children who had been playing had paused their games. The joggers who passed by slowed their pace. Even the traffic sounds from the nearby street seemed to diminish. It was as if the entire world had collectively recognized that something significant was occurring and had agreed to bear witness to it respectfully. The woman with the jogging stroller approached slowly, tentatively, as one might approach a sacred site. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said softly, "but is everything okay? I'm a child psychologist and I've been watching what's happening here. This is extraordinary." Looked up at the woman through her tears. "My granddaughter," she said, her voice trembling. "She hasn't spoken to anyone outside the family in 18 months, and she's speaking. She's speaking to the dog. She's speaking." The woman's eyes widened. She placed a hand over her own mouth, understanding immediately the profound significance of what was unfolding. "This is remarkable," she whispered. "This is truly remarkable. Has anyone documented this? Has anyone recorded what's happening?" "I did," a voice called out. The young father had his phone pointed at them, his expression sheepish but determined. "I started filming about 30 seconds ago. I hope that's okay. I just felt like this moment needed to be captured. It feels important." Officer looked at, his professional instincts reasserting themselves. "Is that acceptable to you, for him to record?" Hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She understood the significance of documentation. She understood that what was happening here might help other children, other families. She understood that this moment, this beautiful, impossible moment, might be meant to be shared. "Yes," she said. "Yes, please record it. Record all of it." Emma seemed oblivious to the growing circle of observers. She remained completely focused on Duke, her small body pressed against the dog's side, her whispered words continuing in a steady stream. "I was sad. Very sad, for long time sad, but now I not sad, you make me happy. Duke make happy, you nice. You listen. You not make me scared, you just nice, just kind, just good." The psychological depth of Emma's words was staggering. She was processing her emotional state, communicating her internal experience, expressing gratitude and connection. These weren't simply random vocalizations or memorized phrases. These were genuine thoughts emerging from a child's consciousness, filtered through the lens of her trauma and her current emotional state. Leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her granddaughter's head. She couldn't speak. Speaking seemed redundant now, almost intrusive. The moment was speaking for itself. The connection between Emma and Duke was speaking. The silence that had surrounded Emma for so long was finally, gracefully breaking. "Thank you," whispered to Officer, though she barely recognized her own voice. "Thank you for bringing him here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing this." Placed a hand on shoulder. "This is extraordinary," he said. "This is the most profound thing I've ever witnessed. In all my years working with Duke, I've never seen anything like this." Emma pulled back slightly from Duke and looked directly at her grandmother. Her eyes were clear, focused, present in a way they hadn't been in months. "Grandma," she said, her voice small but unmistakably deliberate. "I like dog nice. Can Duke stay?" The world seemed to stop rotating. Emma had just asked a question. Emma had just constructed a coherent thought and directed it specifically at her grandmother. The 18-month journey of silence didn't just end in that moment, it transformed into something entirely new. The child who couldn't speak was now speaking. The silence was broken. The door that had been locked had been opened. Pulled Emma into her arms, holding her granddaughter tightly while tears streamed down her face. Around them, the circle of observers had grown larger. People were crying. People were pulling out their phones to record. People were bearing witness to a miracle unfolding in the afternoon sunshine of a Denver park. "Yes, sweetheart," whispered into her granddaughter's hair. "Yes, Duke can stay. Duke can stay as long as you want." And in that moment, everything changed. The footage that began circulating that evening was unassuming in its simplicity. Shot on a smartphone held by a stranger, it captured the essential elements of what had transpired. A small girl in a pink butterfly dress, a large German Shepherd police dog, an officer kneeling nearby, and a grandmother with tears streaming down her face. The video was only 3 minutes long, but in those 3 minutes, the entire trajectory of Emma's life was contained. The audio picked up Emma's whispered words, the gentle commands from Officer, the ambient sounds of the park coming back to life after the miracle had occurred. Didn't immediately understand the significance of what would follow. She was too emotionally overwhelmed, too focused on her granddaughter's unprecedented verbal output. While Emma continued to sit with Duke, occasionally whispering words and observations, had scrolled through the contact list on her phone and called Dr. Williams, Emma's speech therapist. She needed to tell someone professional what had occurred. She needed validation that what she'd witnessed was real and significant. Dr. Williams had arrived at the park within 30 minutes, having rearranged her entire afternoon schedule. She was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually gentle expression. She'd been working with Emma for over a year and had built a relationship of trust with both the child and grandmother. When she arrived and observed Emma still conversing quietly with Duke, still engaged in this extraordinary interaction, tears formed in her own eyes. As a speech therapist who had spent decades working with children who had communication disorders, she recognized immediately that she was witnessing something remarkable. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Williams said, sitting down beside on the park grass. "In all my years of clinical practice, I have never witnessed anything quite like this. The breakthrough in selective mutism is typically gradual, incremental. This is unprecedented." Still overwhelmed by emotion, simply nodded. She couldn't speak without crying. She was functioning on a level of emotional intensity that had temporarily stripped away her capacity for normal articulation. Emma, meanwhile, continued her interaction with Duke, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the growing attention around her. The young father who had recorded the initial footage had already posted it to several social media platforms. He'd included minimal caption, simply writing, "Witnessed something extraordinary at Lincoln Park today. A 3-year-old girl who hasn't spoken in 18 months just found her voice with a police dog. Faith in humanity restored. Denver community policing hope." What happened next occurred with the inexplicable momentum of the internet. By evening, the video had been viewed over 50,000 times. By midnight, it had been shared across multiple platforms and was accumulating comments from around the world. Parents of children with autism, speech therapists, mental health professionals, and ordinary people moved by the moment began sharing their own stories. The video tagged Officer and the Denver Police Department, creating a direct line of visibility for official channels. By Sunday morning, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. News outlets in Denver picked up the story. By Sunday afternoon, national news networks were running segments about the miracle at the park. The narrative was compelling. A silent child, a police dog, a moment of unexpected breakthrough. People wanted to believe in miracles. People wanted to believe in transformation. And this story delivered both in abundance. Phone began ringing. First, it was local news stations requesting interviews, then national networks, then podcast producers, social media influencers, journalists hopping to follow up on the story. Exhausted but also aware that the story might help other families, agreed to a carefully selected set of interviews. She insisted that Emma not be put in uncomfortable situations, that the focus remain on the therapeutic potential of animal-assisted intervention rather than on Emma as a curiosity. Dr. Williams became Emma's unofficial media liaison. She fielded professional inquiries, provided clinical context for journalists, explained the neurological and psychological basis for what had occurred. She was careful to emphasize that while this particular case was extraordinary, animal-assisted therapy had solid research backing it. The breakthrough had been dramatic, but it wasn't without precedent in the clinical literature. Officer found himself transformed from a routine community policing officer into the human face of an emerging movement. The Denver Police Department, recognizing the positive publicity and the genuine therapeutic opportunity, began developing plans for an official K-9 therapy program. Was approached by his commanding officer, Captain, with both praise for his community presence and an interesting proposition. "What you and Duke did that day was remarkable," said during a meeting in her office. "The department has received hundreds of messages from families and mental health professionals expressing interest in animal-assisted therapy programs. I want you to help us develop something official, something structured and professional. Are you interested?" Didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. This could help so many people. I've been thinking about nothing else since Saturday." The requests for information began arriving from around the country. Police departments in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Houston, and dozens of other cities were contacting the Denver Police Department asking about protocols for similar programs. Universities reached out about potential research partnerships. Mental health organizations wanted to collaborate on developing evidence-based guidelines for K-9 therapy interventions. Emma, mercifully, remained largely insulated from the media frenzy, was protective of her granddaughter's privacy, understanding intuitively that Emma had experienced enough disruption and change. The child was allowed to continue her regular therapy sessions with Dr. Williams, who had begun incorporating animal-assisted elements into their work. Emma's progress in the days and weeks following the park encounter was remarkable. Her vocabulary expanded. Her comfort in social situations increased. Her anxiety, which had been her constant companion for so long, began to diminish. Dr. Williams began documenting Emma's case in detail, preparing to present the clinical findings to professional organizations. She consulted with researchers at the University of Colorado studying animal-human bonding and therapeutic intervention. Together, they designed a preliminary study protocol that would examine whether structured K-9 interactions could facilitate breakthrough moments in children with selective mutism and autism spectrum disorder. The story that had begun on a Saturday afternoon in a Denver park was rapidly expanding beyond Emma's personal journey. It was becoming something larger, a catalyst for conversations about mental health, about the therapeutic potential of human-animal connection, about innovative approaches to supporting children with communication disorders. Social media was filled with comments from people sharing their own experiences with animals facilitating emotional breakthroughs. Emma became known in online communities focused on autism and selective mutism as the butterfly dress girl or Duke's girl. Families reaching out to shared stories of their own children, children who couldn't speak, children who were trapped in isolation, children who desperately needed whatever magic had touched Emma, responded to as many messages as she could, offering hope and the contact information for Dr. Williams. What had started as a chance encounter between a 3-year-old girl and a police dog was quickly becoming a national conversation about healing, connection, and the unexpected ways transformation can arrive in our lives. And at the center of it all was Emma, a small girl in a pink butterfly dress, who had finally found her voice. The Denver Police Department's administrative offices occupied a modern building in downtown Denver, all glass and steel and efficiency. Officer sat in the conference room on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the park encounter, presenting his formal proposal to a committee comprised of department leadership, mental health professionals, and representatives from local autism advocacy organizations. He was nervous, not about the proposal itself, which he believed in deeply, but about the possibility that bureaucratic processes might dilute or undermine what had been so pure and organic in that moment with Emma. Captain had been supportive, but she'd also been clear. If wanted to turn this into an official department program, it would need structure, oversight, training protocols, and measurable outcomes. She'd connected him with Dr. Williams and Dr. James from the University of Colorado's psychology department, both of whom had become passionate advocates for formalizing the approach. The spontaneous nature of the breakthrough was beautiful, Doctor explained to the committee, but structured, intentional K-9 interventions could potentially replicate aspects of what occurred and benefit a much broader population. What Officer and his dog Duke accomplished was extraordinary, but we shouldn't leave it to chance. The proposal that emerged from weeks of collaborative development was comprehensive. It outlined training protocols for officers and their dogs, clinical guidelines for therapist partnerships, screening procedures for children who might benefit from the program, safety protocols, data collection methods, and projected outcomes. The program would be called the Denver K-9 Therapeutic Community Initiative, or DKTCI. Captain presented the proposal to the police department's executive command, emphasizing both the therapeutic benefit and the community relations value. Police departments across the country had struggled with public trust and community engagement. A program that genuinely helped vulnerable populations while simultaneously building relationships between law enforcement and residents was unprecedented. The proposal received unanimous approval and was allocated a pilot budget of $250,000 for the first year. Officer was formally assigned to lead the program. He was given a team that included 2 other officers with suitable K-9 partners, Officer Lisa Santos with her Labrador Retriever named Maya, and Officer David Park with his German Shepherd partner named Baron. All 3 officers underwent specialized training in trauma-informed interactions and mental health awareness. They worked with Dr. Williams and Doctor to develop the clinical protocols that would guide their interactions with children. The physical space for the program was established at the Denver Community Mental Health Center, a facility that had existing relationships with families and providers throughout the city. A dedicated room was designed specifically for K-9 therapeutic sessions, calm, quiet, free of overwhelming stimuli, with comfortable seating for children and guardians, and open space for dog-child interaction. The room was painted in soothing colors, furnished with cushioned seating, and equipped with observation windows for clinical staff. Emma became the program's unofficial ambassador, though not in a public-facing way. Rather, she participated regularly in sessions at the facility, allowing her story and her continued progress to ground the program in authentic therapeutic success. By 6 weeks after the park encounter, Emma's vocabulary had expanded significantly. She was speaking in short sentences. She was attending preschool with support and was beginning to make friends. Most remarkably, her anxiety had diminished so substantially that Dr. Williams suggested she no longer met the clinical criteria for selective mutism. The diagnosis wasn't erased. It couldn't be, given her history. But it was in remission, actively managed, transitioning from a defining characteristic to a past challenge. The recruitment process for families to participate in the pilot program was careful and deliberate. Dr. Williams and her clinical team reviewed hundreds of applications from families who had children with selective mutism or autism spectrum disorder accompanied by communication challenges. They selected 30 children for the pilot phase, carefully screened, with parental consent and clinical support. Emma was included, but not as a research subject. She was there as evidence of what was possible, a living testament to the therapeutic potential of human-animal connection. Officer began his sessions with the first cohort of children in early July. The first child was a 6-year-old boy named Interestingly, sharing a name with the officer, who hadn't spoken to anyone outside his immediate family in 3 years. When first met Maya, Officer Santos' gentle Labrador, he exhibited similar patterns to Emma. Intense focus, anxiety, hesitation, then gradually increasing comfort. Within 3 sessions, spoke his first words to Officer Santos. Within 6 weeks, he was speaking in sentences to his therapist. A second child, a 5-year-old girl named Sophia, experienced breakthrough within 4 sessions. A 4-year-old boy named required more time but eventually developed meaningful verbal communication. The results were consistent across the pilot group. Structured, intentional K-9 therapy, paired with professional mental health support, produced measurable improvements in communication, reduction in anxiety, and increased social engagement. Dr. and Dr. Williams began publishing preliminary findings in peer-reviewed journals. The research was rigorous, careful, and impressive. The data showed significant improvements in communication outcomes, anxiety reduction, and social engagement for children who participated in the program compared to control groups receiving standard therapy alone. The results began attracting attention from the broader scientific and mental health communities. Officer gave presentations at law enforcement conferences, mental health professional meetings, and academic symposiums. He spoke about Duke and Emma, about that transformative Saturday in the park, about the realization that police dogs could serve functions beyond traditional law enforcement. His presentations were always grounded in clinical data, but they were also deeply personal, stories of children finding their voices, of families experiencing hope after years of isolation. The Denver Police Department received inquiries from police departments in 43 states asking about the program. Captain-in-Chief of Police, Hammond decided to create a comprehensive training manual and implementation guide that could be shared with other departments. They assembled a team to develop detailed protocols, training curricula, and evidence-based guidelines that could be adapted to different contexts and communities. By September, just 4 months after Emma's breakthrough, the first police department outside Denver, the Austin Police Department in Texas, had begun implementing their own K-9 therapeutic community program, directly modeled on Denver's approach. Within 6 months, 12 additional police departments had launched similar initiatives. Emma, meanwhile, had become more than a symbol. She had become a catalyst. At 5 years old, she was speaking fluently, attending mainstream first grade, participating in extracurricular activities, and no longer defined by her selective mutism diagnosis. She visited the program facility regularly with, helping new children understand that speaking was possible, that connection was achievable, that the silence that had trapped her could be overcome. Officer understood the significance of what they'd created. What had begun as a spontaneous interaction between a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had been transformed into a structured, evidence-based therapeutic intervention that was now helping children across the nation. The program had legitimacy because it was grounded in rigorous research and clinical best practices. But it also had heart because it was rooted in authentic human-animal connection and genuine commitment to healing vulnerable children. As he prepared Emma for her role as program ambassador, as he trained new officers and dogs, as he reviewed research data and attended national conferences, Officer carried with him the memory of that first Saturday afternoon. He remembered Emma's trembling hand reaching out to touch Duke's fur. He remembered tears of joy. He remembered the profound realization that sometimes the most powerful healing comes not from complex clinical interventions, but from simple, authentic connection between human and animal. The National Police Chiefs Conference took place in Chicago in November, exactly 6 months after Emma's breakthrough at Lincoln Park. Over 3,000 law enforcement leaders from across the United States gathered for 3 days of presentations, networking, and professional development. Officer stood backstage in the main conference hall, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He'd given presentations before, but nothing quite like this. Nothing with this level of national attention and expectation. Captain had introduced him to the conference organizers, emphasizing the remarkable success of the Denver K-9 program. A slot was opened in the premier session, typically reserved for discussions of crime prevention and officer wellness. But the conference leadership recognized that what Denver had created transcended traditional law enforcement functions. This was something genuinely innovative, genuinely powerful, and genuinely newsworthy. Took the stage to a packed auditorium. 3,000 police officers, chiefs, and law enforcement administrators sat in rapt attention. Behind him on the large screen was a photograph of Emma in her pink butterfly dress, hand resting on Duke's head, her small face filled with wonder. The caption read, "Everything changed here." 6 months ago, Officer began, his voice steady despite his nerves, I was conducting a routine community policing event at a park in Denver. I had no idea that day would transform not just one child's life, but would eventually lead to a movement that is reshaping how law enforcement connects with vulnerable populations across this country. He then told Emma's story. He described her silence, her isolation, her grandmother's desperation. He talked about that moment in the park, about Duke's instinctive gentleness, about the first whispered words. He showed video footage of Emma speaking, her halting, uncertain words gradually becoming more confident. There wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. What happened with Emma wasn't magic, continued. It was connection. It was presence. It was a police dog and a police officer being authentically available to a child in crisis. And it turns out that connection has therapeutic power. He then presented the research. Dr. Williams had provided comprehensive data showing significant outcomes across the pilot cohort. 92% of children who completed the program showed measurable improvements in communication. 87% demonstrated reduced anxiety symptoms. 78% met clinical criteria for major improvement in social engagement. The results were extraordinary. The Denver K9 Therapeutic Community Initiative isn't just about helping children with selective mutism or autism, explained. It's about reimagining the role of police officers in communities. It's about building trust through genuine therapeutic engagement. It's about recognizing that our dogs and our training can serve functions that extend far beyond traditional law enforcement. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By the end of his presentation, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause. Police chiefs lined up during the break to speak with him, to ask about implementation, to request consultation and training. By the end of the conference, had received inquiry forms from 48 police departments across 32 states. The media coverage was extensive. National news networks ran stories about the program. Major newspapers featured articles about the K9 Therapeutic Initiative. The New York Times published a feature titled, "How a Police Dog Unlocked a Silent Child's Voice and Changed Law Enforcement." The Washington Post ran an editorial arguing that this model represented the future of community policing. CNN interviewed Officer Dr. Williams and Emma's grandmother, drawing connections between therapeutic intervention and community trust building. Universities began reaching out to the Denver program with research partnership proposals. The University of Colorado expanded its collaboration with the program, bringing in faculty from psychology, education, and social work departments. Researchers from MIT, Johns, and Yale requested access to the program's data and protocols. The therapeutic effectiveness of human-animal bonding, particularly in the context of trauma and communication disorders, became a hot topic in academic circles. Dr. Williams, Emma's original speech therapist, found herself transformed into a nationally recognized expert. She was invited to present at the American Speech-Language Hearing Association Conference, the American Psychological Association's annual meeting, and countless other professional gatherings. She published a groundbreaking paper titled K9 Facilitated Communication, Evidence-Based Therapeutic Protocol for Children with Selective Mutism and Autism Spectrum Disorder. The paper was cited extensively in subsequent research and became foundational text in the emerging field of police-based animal-assisted therapy. The Department of Justice took notice. Federal grants began flowing to police departments implementing K9 therapeutic programs. The Office of Community Policing Services allocated specific funding lines for animal-assisted therapy training and implementation. By the end of the first year following Emma's breakthrough, 56 police departments in the United States had launched K9 therapeutic programs. By the end of year 2, the number had grown to 143. The expansion created new challenges and opportunities. Different police departments had different resources, different dog training programs, different community mental health partnerships. The Denver program responded by developing comprehensive implementation guidelines and training curricula that could be adapted to different contexts. They created a certification program for officers interested in becoming K9 therapeutic facilitators. They established an online network for departments implementing the program, allowing for information sharing and collaborative problem-solving. International attention followed. Police departments in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European countries inquired about implementing similar programs. Officer was invited to speak at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference. The model began spreading beyond American borders, adapted for different cultural contexts and systems. Mental health organizations across the country began integrating K9 therapy into their standard treatment protocols. Autism advocacy groups partnered with police departments to expand access to the programs. Schools began collaborating with local law enforcement to bring therapeutic dog programs into educational settings. The movement had transcended its original context as a Denver Police Department initiative and had become a genuine national phenomenon. Emma, now 6 years old and thriving in first grade, was invited to meet with senior government officials. She met with the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. She spoke, with support, to a congressional committee exploring innovative approaches to mental health intervention in children. Her story became a symbol of what was possible when communities prioritized healing and connection over isolation and fear. Officer was promoted to lieutenant and appointed director of the National K9 Community Mental Health Initiative. A new department was created within the Denver Police Department specifically to support the expansion and implementation of similar programs nationwide. Worked with the FBI, the Secret Service, and other federal law enforcement agencies to develop K9 therapy protocols that could be integrated into federal operations. Universities began establishing K9 therapy research centers. The University of Pennsylvania, the University of Michigan, and UCLA all opened dedicated research facilities studying animal-assisted intervention for childhood trauma and communication disorders. Grant funding flooded these programs. Peer-reviewed journals published dozens of rigorous studies confirming the therapeutic efficacy of structured K9 interventions. The transformation was comprehensive and far-reaching. What had begun as one spontaneous interaction between a 3-year-old girl in a pink butterfly dress and a police dog named Duke had evolved into a nationwide movement that was reshaping how America approached law enforcement, mental health treatment, and human-animal therapeutic connection. Police departments that had once been viewed with suspicion in mental health communities were now recognized as valuable partners in therapeutic intervention. Officers sometimes reflected on that Saturday afternoon in Lincoln Park, understanding that the cascade of change that followed had been both inevitable and entirely unpredictable. One moment of authentic human-animal connection had triggered a revolution in how America understood the intersection of law enforcement, mental health, and healing. And at the heart of it all remained the memory of Emma's trembling hand reaching out to touch Duke's fur, and the whispered words that changed everything. "Good dog. Nice dog." Emma stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Colorado History Center, looking out at the Denver skyline glittering in the afternoon sunlight. She was 5.5 years old now, though the specific number hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was that she was here, present, engaged, alive in ways that her younger self could never have imagined. She wore a lavender dress with embroidered flowers, not the pink butterfly dress anymore, though that precious garment hung carefully preserved in its bedroom closet, a tangible reminder of the day everything changed. "Are you nervous?" asked gently, placing a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. Emma turned from the window and shook her head. She'd learned not to be nervous about public appearance, not anymore. The shyness that had once defined her had transformed into something more nuanced, a thoughtful carefulness, a preference for listening before speaking, but no longer the paralyzing anxiety that had kept her trapped in silence. "No," Emma said clearly, her voice carrying the confident tone of a child who'd learned to trust her own voice. "I like talking about Duke and Grandma and how everything changed." Today was the official dedication of the Denver K9 Therapeutic Center, a sprawling new facility built specifically to house the expanded program. The center occupied a renovated warehouse in North Denver, transformed into a state-of-the-art therapeutic environment with multiple dog interaction rooms, observation spaces for clinicians and researchers, training facilities for officers and dogs, and administrative offices. The project had been funded through a combination of police department budget allocations, private donations, and federal grants. Emma had been invited to participate in the ribbon-cutting ceremony and to share her story with the gathered media and community members. The auditorium was packed. Law enforcement leaders, mental health professionals, parents of children who'd benefited from the program, researchers, and members of the community filled the space. On the stage, Officer, now Lieutenant, stood with Captain, Chief Hammond, Dr. Williams, Dr. James, and Officer Santos and Officer Park stood to the side with Maya and Baron, the other therapeutic dogs who'd become integral to the program. Duke, now 7 years old and still actively serving both in law enforcement and therapeutic capacities, sat beside Lieutenant. The dog's muzzle had grayed slightly, and he moved with the measured dignity of a senior animal who'd earned his respect. But his eyes remained alert, intelligent, and when he looked at Emma, they seemed to glow with recognition and affection. Mayor Michael was present to provide official remarks. The mayor had initially been skeptical about allocating city resources to what some had called a social experiment, but the data had been undeniable. The program had generated positive community relations, had attracted national attention and federal funding, and most importantly, had genuinely helped vulnerable children. What began 2 years ago as one child's breakthrough has transformed into a movement that is redefining what it means to serve and protect our community, the mayor said. Emma's story is Denver's story, and we are honored to be the birthplace of this important initiative. As Emma took the stage to speak, a hush fell over the auditorium. She walked to the microphone, still small enough that a special stand had been positioned to allow her to reach it comfortably, and looked out at the sea of faces. Stood in the wings, ready to provide support if needed, but Emma had requested to do this on her own. She was strong enough now. She was brave enough. "My name is Emma," she began, her voice clear and steady. 2 years ago I didn't talk to people. I was scared and sad, and I didn't use words. She paused, seeming to carefully consider her next words. Then I met Duke at the park. Duke was nice to me. Officer was nice to me. And I started talking again. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Now I go to school with my friends. I do lots of things. I talk all the time. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the auditorium. Other kids got to meet dogs too, and they started talking. I'm glad Duke helped them. Duke is a good dog. Duke is the best dog. She turned to look directly at Lieutenant. Thank you for bringing Duke to the park that day. You helped me find my voice, and you helped lots of other people too. When Emma finished speaking and stepped back from the microphone, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause. Came onto the stage and held her granddaughter, tears streaming down her face, tears that had become familiar to her over the past 2 years. Tears of gratitude, tears of joy, tears of healing finally made manifest. Dr. Williams presented research findings showing that the Denver K-9 therapeutic program had now served over 270 children with documented therapeutic breakthroughs. 143 police departments across 37 states had implemented similar programs. International expansion was in 9 countries. Publications in peer-reviewed journals had exceeded 85. The therapeutic model was no longer experimental or innovative. It was becoming standard practice. What began as clinical observation of one extraordinary interaction, Dr. Williams explained, has been systematically validated, refined, and expanded into evidence-based practice that is transforming mental health intervention across this nation. Emma's breakthrough was genuine and authentic, and it opened our eyes to therapeutic possibilities that we had previously overlooked. Lieutenant was formally appointed as director of the National K-9 Therapeutic Initiative. A new federal position, it represented official government recognition of the program's importance and potential. Would spend half his time working directly with the Denver program and half his time consulting with police departments across the country, training officers, and supporting research initiatives. Emma continued to attend the center regularly, though now more as an ambassador and program mentor rather than as a child receiving therapeutic services. She would sit with newly arriving children, demonstrating through her own presence and her own voice that communication was possible, that connection was achievable, that the silence could be broken. Many of the children who met Emma, who saw living proof of what was possible, experienced their own breakthroughs more rapidly than might otherwise have occurred. Now 70 years old, became deeply involved in the program's family support components. She understood intimately the burden that families carried when raising children with communication disorders. She became a peer mentor, working with grandparents and parents who were raising children with autism and selective mutism, offering both practical guidance and emotional support grounded in her own experience of desperation and eventual transcendence. The pink butterfly dress that Emma had worn on that transformative day in Lincoln Park was donated to the Colorado History Center. It hung in a climate-controlled display case, with a placard explaining its significance. Visitors who saw it were moved by the humble simplicity of the garment, and by the story of what had occurred when the child wearing it encountered a dog and an open heart. 5 years after Emma's breakthrough, research had conclusively demonstrated that K9 therapeutic intervention could facilitate communication breakthroughs in children with selective mutism at rates exceeding traditional therapeutic approaches by a factor of 3. Universities were training the next generation of mental health professionals in animal-assisted intervention protocols. Police academies were beginning to incorporate K9 therapy training into their curricula. The movement had fundamentally altered how America approached the intersection of law enforcement and mental health. Emma, now 8 years old, was thriving. She was a strong reader, a good friend, a confident student who raised her hand in class and participated actively in discussions. She had overcome her diagnosis, though the term overcome felt insufficient for describing the complete transformation from isolated silence to engaged participation in the world. She played soccer. She took piano lessons. She performed in a school musical. She was, in every meaningful sense, a typical, healthy, flourishing child. And it had all begun with a point. A small girl's finger extended toward a dog in a Denver park on a Saturday afternoon in May, when a grandmother's desperate prayer met a police officer's open heart, and a German shepherd's instinctive gentleness, and a moment that changed everything unfolded. "I remember when I couldn't talk," Emma said one evening, sitting with and looking at old photographs. "I remember being scared. I remember not knowing how to make the words come out." She paused thoughtfully. "But I don't feel scared anymore. I feel happy. I feel like me now." Pulled her granddaughter close. "Yes, sweetheart, you feel like you. You found yourself, and now you help other people find themselves too." The legacy of that moment in the park continued to expand, rippling through communities, transforming institutions, changing lives. One child's breakthrough had become a nation's awakening to the therapeutic power of connection. And at the heart of it all remained the memory of that first moment, Emma's trembling hand reaching out, Duke's patient presence, and the quiet miracle of a voice finding its way back to the world.